This evening, Books and Books, in collaboration with the Cuban Research Institute at FIU, is very pleased to present tonight's panel discussion on the journey Cuban Studies, volumes 43 and 44. Tonight featuring Dr. Alejandro de la Fuente, Dr. Carmelo Mesa Largo, and Dr. Lillian Guerra. But here to introduce our panelists this evening, will you please welcome the Director of the Cuban Research Institute, Mr. George Duane.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to partner with Books and Books to bring the best authors on Cuban and Cuban-American authors. We do book presentations here almost every month, and there are a few flyers out there for those of you who might be interested in coming to the next ones. And it's a special pleasure to introduce tonight's panel and the two latest issues of the journal Cuban Studies, which has served for more than 4 decades as the most important venue for scholarly work, both on Cuba and its diaspora, in the humanities and the social sciences. And before I introduce the distinguished panel, I have to say that I have a very strong personal connection to the journal as well, because it published my first academic article as a graduate student way back in 1982. And I've also been a proud member of the editorial board of Cuban Studies on 2 occasions between 2000 and 2011, and now again since 2014. So to introduce our 3 distinguished guests, I think one of the very interesting things that happens in this panel is that we have almost three different generations, although not quite, of Cuban scholars in the United States with, yes, you are. So we have someone in the middle, someone in the other end, and of course we have a very senior scholar, Dr. Carmelo Mesa Largo. So very shortly, because we want to hear them and you don't want to hear me, I'd like to begin with Alejandro de la Fuente, who is currently the senior editor of the journal. Alejandro has several very long titles, including Robert Wood's Bliss Professor in Latin American History and Economics. I remember one time I asked him if that meant that they paid him more because he had all these long titles. He said he wasn't paid more. But he's also a professor of African and African American Studies and of History, director of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at the Hutchins Centers for African and African American Research at Harvard University. He's a historian of Latin America, Cuba, and the Caribbean, who specializes in the study of comparative slavery and race relations. Previously, before Harvard, he taught at the University of Pittsburgh, University of South Florida, and the University of Havana. He is the author of 2 very well-regarded books, Havana, the Atlantic in the 16th Century, published in 2008, and a classic, really, which has been translated into Spanish as well, titled A Nation for All, Race, Inequality, and Politics in 20th Century Cuba, published in 2001. Our second presenter, although I'm not sure if that's the order, but that's the one that I have prepared, will be Dr. Carmelo Mesa Largo, a distinguished service professor emeritus of economics and Latin American studies at the University of Pittsburgh, where he created sort of a mafia, I think. Almost everyone who had to do anything with Cuba and Latin America passed through Pittsburgh at one point or another. Carmelo is the author, at my last count, of 93 books and pamphlets and 300 articles on chapters, published in 7 languages and 34 countries on the Cuban economy, social security, and comparative economic systems. When I grow up, I want to be like Carmelo. And of course, the main reason he's here is that he was a founding editor. Thank you. And one of the main reasons why he's here is because he founded this journal, Cuban Studies, many years ago, and remained for 18 years the editor of the journal. Among his most recent books are Cuba under Raúl Castro, Assessing the Reforms with Jorge Pérez López, published in 2013, which is an updated version of a Spanish language book on the same topic. And also recently he published Social Protection Systems in Latin America, Cuba, in 2013, which is one of his long-standing interests. And next we'll hear from Dr. Lillian Guerra, who has also a very distinguished title, the Waldo W. Nykirk. Am I pronouncing it right? Nykirk? Professor of Cuban and Caribbean History at the University of Florida in Gainesville. Lily is the author of many scholarly essays and 3 extremely well-regarded books, among them Visions of Power in Cuba, Revolution, Redemption, and Resistance, 1959 to 1971, published in 2012, which we had the pleasure of presenting here a few years ago, and which also earned the most distinguished prize of the Latin American Studies Association last year, or the year before maybe. Yes. She's also the author of The Myth of José Martí, Conflicting Nationalism in Early 20th Century Cuba, and has received the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship and the American Council of Learned Societies Fellowships. And she's here as the book review editor of Cuban Studies. Before I turn it over to, I think Alejandro will be the first, I also want to recognize Dr. Alejandro Portes, who came in a few minutes ago, somewhere in the back. And Alejandro is a professor emeritus of sociology at Princeton University and one of the contributors to volume 43 of the journal. So without further ado, please help me welcome Alejandro Fuente.
Thank you, Jorge, for your kind introduction and for the opportunity to come back to Miami and to escape Boston in February, which is not a bad thing to do, of course. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to share this panel with my colleagues and friends, Carmelo Mesalago, the founding editor of Cuban Studies, and with Lily Guerra, who is the first person I called once I accepted to be the editor a couple of years ago. She was the very first person I called to constitute the editorial team of Cuban Studies. A couple of years ago, in 2013, when I accepted the editorship of Cuban Studies, the journal was, to be frank, going through a rather difficult period. It had been somewhat inactive for a number of years. It didn't have a permanent editorial team anymore, and it was being published in a rather casual way. Many people, in fact, many scholars, myself included, believed that the journal had basically reached the end of its life. That Cuban Studies was going to be no more, that this had been an interesting intellectual project, an interesting intellectual experiment, that a previous generation of Cubanists, the so-called Cubanologos, right, of the 1970s and 1980s, of those terrible years of miscommunication and mutual negations, like Ambrosio Fornet used to say, that this was a project of that generation, the generation of Carmelo, the generation of Jorge Dominguez, of Jorge Pérez López, of Enrique Mario Santi, the people grouped around the Instituto de Estudios Cubanos of Maria Cristina Herrera, who would have been here today if she could have been, right? And that basically, perhaps the time for the journal had passed and that it was time to let it go. It was also that, frankly, many scholars also believed that Cuban studies as a field, not the journal, but the field, was not that sexy anymore, you know? The best years of the Cuban Revolution were certainly over by 2013. No more troops in Africa, no more guerrillas in Latin America, no more leadership of the non-aligned movement. Cuba, the Cuban, sort of the global footprint of Cuba had been reduced significantly by 2013. So many people also felt that the time for Cuban studies as a field had perhaps also passed. And I had to think about these things before embarking on taking the journal. And I always saw my role, and I still see my role, as bringing the journal back, putting it at the level where it always was, changing the cover, because the old cover was absolutely ugly, right? Cuba produces great art. Bringing the journal back to life, and then handing the journal to a new generation of Cubanistas, to a new generation of younger Cuban scholars, of which there are actually many out there. Because, in fact, when I looked around, I didn't see any scholarly crisis. What I saw was an incredibly vibrant field. It was not the same field as in the 1970s and 80s. In the 70s and 80s, the field was dominated by as you would expect, by traditional disciplines. History, political science, literature, economics. Those were the big fields. Well, now the field is way more diverse thematically. It's way more diverse in terms of disciplines. It's also way more diverse in terms of the demographic and composition of the authorship of the people producing Cuban studies. And it's also that the centers of intellectual production about Cuba are not just Cuba and the US anymore. There are many excellent scholars producing excellent work on Cuba in Europe, in European universities, and across Latin America. In part because of the exodus of the people of my generation who left Cuba in the early 1990s and settled in many cases in universities around the world. So now the field of Cuban studies is actually enriched with contributions coming from cultural studies, women's and gender studies, LGTB studies, racial and ethnic studies, a whole new range of fields that were very poorly represented before. And I decided that the future of the journal, Cuban Studies, could not depend on whether Cuba was able to send troops to Angola or not, that there had to be a different rationale. This journal was never really a political journal. It was politicized by Cuban authorities for many years. It was for many years perceived and presented as something as a tool of the so-called Cubanología. You could not read it at the Biblioteca Nacional when I was growing up. You had to have a special permission to read the journal. But the journal was never really a tool of political propaganda. In fact, what really made Cuban studies so strange and so unique and so rare is that this was perhaps the one and only platform where you could read very serious research on Cuba during the 1970s and the 1980s, regardless of political affiliations and ideological commitments. And that's why it was in this journal where, for the very first time, scholars from Cuba who lived in Cuba had the opportunity to exchange views, sometimes in a polemic way, with scholars who lived in the United States. I'm talking about the early 1980s here, okay? This was unheard of. So Cuban studies was and had always been this space of serious scholarship that showcased serious scholarship about Cuba. And that, to me, looked like a very, very strong foundation on which to build. A foundation that was strong enough that we should, in fact, take the challenge, seize the opportunity, and bring Cuban studies back to life. And that is what I have done. I have to admit that there is also a personal issue here, and that is that Carmelo is a very dear friend. It's like family to me, has been a very dear friend and has been like family to me since I arrived in this country in 1992. I worked at the journal as a student back in the 1990s when I was a doctoral student at the University of Pittsburgh. And something in me told me that we should not let Cuban studies die, that this is something that we should not allow. I hope these two issues, the first two issues we have produced, that have been produced by this new editorial team, will convince you that this was the right decision to make. The issues, they do reflect this variety of thematic variety, this variety of disciplines and contributions that I was making reference to before. You will find on volume 43, which I don't have here, but it's up there, a dossier on demography with contributions by three very important contributions. One of them, an excellent study about the consequences of aging in the Cuban population, authored by Sergio Díaz-Briquets. Sergio Díaz-Briquets basically talks about an impending demographic crisis in Cuba because how fast the population is aging, combined with very high rates of emigration among youngsters. So this is a population that is aging rapidly, and the young are leaving the country. And he's basically giving us an x-ray of this situation. A second contribution in that dossier is the first serious scholarly examination that I have ever read about infant mortality in Cuba. Not a political diatribe about whether those figures are true or not. We've read many of those. They're not worth a dime. They're not worth our time. This is a serious and meticulous, even boring academic examination.
It's not boring.
Well, but it's not a novel, okay? But if you want to understand how those figures are produced, this is your text. And then another article in that dossier by my tocayo and my colleague and friend Alejandro Portes, who is sitting way there in the back, which is an examination of how the Cuban American community in Miami is actually what as he calls a bifurcated community. That there are two different sectors of this community in the pre and post Mariel period in areas like income and opportunities and all that. But that issue also has the first historical piece that I know of that deals with Mazorra, with the history of Mazorra, okay? It has an article that deals with the residentes of Las Yaguas, the slum dwellers of Havana. So this, and it has then an article on visual arts on Lázaro Saavedra in Cuba. So that gives you a sense of the variety of topics on Cuban Studies 43. Cuban Studies 44, which I had not seen the issue, I'm seeing it for the first time today, actually, just arrived here before it arrived to my desk, contains a dossier produced by a group of Cuban economists affiliated with the Centro de Estudios de la Economía Cubana at the University of Havana, where they assess critically the impact of the reforms introduced by President Raúl Castro. This is a dossier that was coordinated by my colleague Jorge Dominguez. Yeah, okay. Okay. So what do I do with this, Lily? How do you turn that off? This issue, folks, if I may, and I will finish with this issue also has a very interesting piece of historical research about those labor camps and re-education camps in the 1960s in Cuba, which you probably know about, UMAP. Again, this is a serious piece, the very first piece of serious research that I know of that deals with UMAP and that we are publishing here. Cuba may not be as powerful or as popular as it once was. Our national ego perhaps has been properly reduced to size during the last few years. But Cuban Studies, the journal, has nothing to do with that. What we do is to promote a scholarly mission. What we do is to showcase the very best scholarship produced on Cuba by anybody, Cuban or not, anywhere in the world, of course, including authors in Cuba. I think what we want to do was captured beautifully by a review that Foreign Affairs published about issue 43 just a couple of months ago. This is what the reviewer said, and I'll finish with that. I quote, "This multidisciplinary journal is a must-read for those looking beyond the headlines for a deeper understanding of the rapid changes taking place in the island." End of the quote. Indeed, if you want to read beyond the headlines, Cuban Studies is the place. Okay, thank you.
Buenas noches. As I am the oldest in the group, I would like to do a little bit of history about the journal Cuban Studies. And we are back in 1970, and there was a phenomenal need for bibliographical sources on Cuba. Therefore, there was a group of scholars that met at the Hispanic Foundation in the Library of Congress. What can we do in order to be knowledgeable about what has been published in Cuba all over the world? And lucky for us, they decided to create a newsletter, a bibliographical newsletter, and they appointed me director of that publication, and it was housed in Pittsburgh since 1990. 1970, yeah. So the board then, unfortunately, was made basically by Cuban scholars, serious Cuban scholars, but it was impossible at that time to get people from Europe and even more difficult from Cuba. So the Cuban Studies newsletter, Boletín de Estudios sobre Cuba, was published from 1970 to 1974. It was published 3 times a year. It was distributed free, financed by the Center for Latin American Studies at Pitt. And it had entries from all over the world. We gave priority to Cuban materials, which were the most difficult to find out at the time. Also, we introduced a list of doctoral dissertations. Since the beginning, the journal was looking for young talent working on Cuba. And we provided all the information so that you will be able to locate those dissertations, and they were classified by topic. The bibliography also was classified by topics. And then there were special issues devoted, for instance, Lourdes Casals on literature, and Nelson Valdez on women in the 20th century. I think it was a pioneer in terms of bibliography in that subject. Well, after 4 years, we realized that we have to expand, that it was not enough to have a bibliography. We have to have a real journal. So in 1974, we began Cuban Studies Estudios Cubanos. And also 3 times a year, and included scholarly articles, dossiers, book reviews, and serious debate. The principles of the journal were, number 1, it should be multidisciplinary. This is very important, and it has been kept until today. And then second, an exchange of views with subjectivity, professionalism, and respect to all documented opinions. And this principle also, I am glad to say, that continue today. The board then included some very famous European Cubanistas, as well as Canadian. Not yet on Cuba. Eventually, we were able to have the first one, Manuel Moreno Frajinals, who was, of course, one of the masters in Cuban economic history and Latin American economic history. Many of today well-established Cubanistas published their first article in Cuban Study. We just heard Jorge say that your first article was published there. Also, Archibald Ritter, Jorge Perez Lopez, Clarence Brundenius. We have a series of people with different points of views and ideologies publishing the first time in the journal. And also Antonio Aja, who is a very famous Cuban demographer. For the first article in English was published in our journal. There were papers from 2 international conferences that were organized at Pittsburgh. One was on Cuba in Africa, a very hot topic at the time, and the other one was Cuba in the world. And there were debates, as Alejandro mentioned, and the first one, it was, I think, a very interesting one. We have a world debate on the so-called Cubanology, and you have involved on that scholars from Sweden, the United States, and Cuba. And the main author on that in Cuba was Jose Luis Rodriguez, that later on became the Minister of Economics and Planning. And I proposed to him the following. I said, why don't we exchange articles on the subject? Your article, I will publish in Cuban Studies, I will translate it, and then I will send to you so that you can revise it to be sure that it's true to your word. And then my article, you publish it in Cuba. And it was done. I think it was the first time there was an academic exchange between economists from the United States specialized in Cuba economy and Cuban economists in the island. We have all the controversies, the rectification process with Susan Eckstein, a very interesting one too. And there were periodic reviews of Cuban statistics to keep the people informed in a relatively simple way of what was new and what were the problems in terms of the availability and reliability of the Cuban data. The journal became the prime source of information on Cuba and was judged highly objective all over the world. And it was sent free to many Cuban universities, and still I think they do from the library in Pittsburgh in exchange for their publication. So it was quite difficult to keep publishing a journal 3 times a year, and hence the board decided to convert it into a yearbook, which was called Cuban Studies. We unfortunately dropped the Spanish title by suggestion from the publisher, that it would be more easy to distribute. It wasn't, even if you had articles in Spanish as well as in English, once in Portuguese. Today we have the 44th issue. I have to say two things. First of all, this is the thickest of all. The cover is beautiful because before it was a blue, boring, dull cover. And of course, the most important thing is the content, and it's absolutely wonderful. He gave me the index today, and I was able to go quickly through some of the articles published there. Alejandro de la Fuente has infused new life into Cuban studies, appointed the most diverse board in the history of the publication, including many internationally known scholars who live in Cuba. Issue 43, as he said, groundbreaking articles. I am particularly interested in one that he mentioned by Roberto Gonzalez on infant mortality in Cuba. I have written a lot about this topic because one of my specialization is social policy. When I saw this article given at the ASCII, Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, I was astonished. I couldn't believe what this guy was doing. And so was Sergio López Frisquet, which is probably one of the best demographers and healthcare experts on Cuba. And so I was so glad that this article was published in the journals from a very young guy. I think it was his doctoral dissertation that he presented there. And also, Lily Guerra is in charge of the book reviews. I know how difficult is that task. Another tradition of the journal is doing a great job. So I feel very proud of Cuban Studies. It was a pioneer publication based on serious academic work on Cuba, a highly influential vehicle to promote debate among Cubanistas from all over the world. My gratitude to Ale and Lily for revitalizing Cuban Studies, and my hope it will continue for future generations. And one final word, Maria Cristina, wherever you are, I love you. Thank you. ¿Cuánto tiempo? ¿Cuánto tiempo?
¿Te sobró el tiempo?
¿Me sobró el tiempo? Vamos, lo coges tú.
Estamos maravillados que le sobró el tiempo a Carmelo porque a los cubanos nunca nos sobra el tiempo. I'm not even going to translate that. I'm very proud to be here. I'm going to comment only on sort of two themes. One is the fact that I think that my generation, I'm in my mid-40s, we won't say exactly how much, but my generation was the first generation of Cuba scholars to be able, and I should say I was born in the United States. I had more than 180 relatives in Cuba when I first went there. My generation of Cuba scholars was the first to ask, really, for lots of time in Cuba to do research. And I was told that by both governments. And the only requirement when I went in 1996 was that I not leave. I wasn't given a multiple entry visa. I had to stay the whole time. And Clinton gave me 24 months, and the Cubans gave me 13. So what I wanted to get at with that point is that what I discovered is something that I continue to believe is characteristic of Cuba scholars, serious Cuba scholars, regardless of field, and that is trust. I arrived in 1996 and spent 8 months of my time there at the Archivo Nacional every day, from the moment they opened to the moment they closed. I never took lunch, and I was the first person to bring a laptop. And the director had lots of problems with this. Among them, I should pay for the electricity. Macintoshes back then the battery lasted an hour. Now, the people sitting at my table included Marial Iglesias, Reynaldo Funes, Oida Evia, people I consider great scholars. I mean, I could keep going on because everybody, I think, of my generation was sitting at our table. Fernando Misas, I mean, it's amazing. And they were all people who were working with pencils that they had to sharpen with cuchitas de afeitar, which are razor blades. And they were using note cards that they had recycled from cut-up pieces of paper that had been tossed away by their institution. So there I was with a laptop, typing, transcribing hundreds of documents. I mean, literally in 9-point font. And if you print it all out double-spaced, it's ridiculous. It's something like 2,000 pages or 3,000 pages. It's crazy. And never once did anyone at that table question my presence there, nor did they impede my research. And that, I think, is very characteristic of the kind of exchanges that Cuban studies represents. You know, there's a trust. You said that it's hard to be a book review editor. It has been the easiest job that I have ever taken on. You know, I send these emails out where I don't even, you know, if you are an academic, you often receive invitations that sort of rote, formulaic, and I write invitations to review a book where I say, oye chico, do you think you could review, you know, this book is 900 words, you know, we need to have it by more or less this time, but you know if you need more time. And people respond, and it's so interesting that about half of the people to whom I write, I've never actually met. We just know each other's work, and then we know each other by these personal reputations that have been gained through time on the island or by simply being connected to one another through people on the island. When I've asked, when Reinaldo Funes, who is my counterpart on the island, to do, you know, something. I mean, there's no question that we would doubt one another's scholarly commitment to the task. And the task is recovery of memory, which is my second topic. Don't worry, I'm not going to go over. In Cuba, one of the things that I've spent 20 years now, because it's amazing, in 1996 and we're 2016, and I've been to Cuba 48 times. In that time, in those various visits, none of which were, you know, until very recently, I have a kid, you know, they've all been very long visits. And that's the other thing, too, that you learn as a historian. You have to never, you have to be there for a long time. Para que nunca they can't get rid of you. You know, when they realize they can't get rid of you at the National Library, and wherever you are, people will provide access even when they have been instructed not to do so. And historians all face this, whether they're foreign or they're domestic, the lack of access. And memory has been a tremendous archive, especially of the revolution, for Cubans, you know, on the island, abroad, but especially those who stayed. People have access to grind, people suffered, people believed, people became disillusioned, people continue to believe, people have suffered because of their continuance of a belief in something that no longer exists as they understood it was supposed to exist. And so in so many ways, people are your primary vectors for researching virtually any topic on the revolution, which is the hardest period to study. But we can just simply point out the fact that at the National Archive, no president has had his papers processed beyond Machado. So it stops in 33. So that, you know, you don't have Secretaría de la Presidencia, that fondo, which we should have for the post-period of 33. We don't have it. So even when you're not working on the revolution, you can't find this stuff. You're a lucky man or woman if you work on the colony. You know, the colonial period, they're more colonialists than any other field of history. So to get back to this issue of memory and my how I think Cuban studies represents it, I mean, frankly, you know, I think that what I'm most proud of is the facility with which I proposed to Alejandro that we have an oral history section, and with which he accepted it, you know. And I have gained tremendously. I mean, I have someone here who has rendered hours of his time sitting next to me. Carmelo gave me a 6.5-hour interview, which of course we should publish in edited form. I have Pepe Puente Blanco, who was the last elected president of FEO, who was a principal, the Federation of Cuban Students in the 1950s, a principal activist against the Batista dictatorship. And key to like really important moments of the movement, the civic and armed movement of students, including headed by Jose Antonio Echeverria against Fidel Castro, and he's here this evening. So I've learned greatly from people on the island, their memories who've directed me to certain places, but I've found that once asked, would you give me an interview? Nobody on the island has ever turned me down. Nobody here in the United States either. And that we are doing something on oral history, to me, is a great contribution. Because what it shows is that you can do it. And so to end, I think the proof in the pudding is the content of these volumes, that they show and demonstrate the trust factor that we as a group of economists or art historians or whoever we might be who work on Cuba and do so in an intense way, trust one another, and we allow each other to critique our work with the assumption that that the critique is not ideologically driven. And that may have been something that was enforced and policed in another decade, in previous decades, but it hasn't been for a long time. And Cuban studies has allowed us to show that when we are free to really engage each other, we can do it, and we can do wonderful stuff, unique stuff, and we can share knowledge and information and access and connections and ideas, and gain something for it. So I am tremendously grateful to be a part of this process. I think Cuban studies has a future. It has extraordinary past, thanks to Carmelo Mesalago and others, but it has a tremendous future. Thank you.
So I asked everybody to stay with 10 minutes so that you could ask questions or comments or whatever. Please.
I have a question for you, which is Russia has a long history of scholarship. Yet generally, I have not found Russian works related to Cuba being published in the United States. Even I notice in the group that you have formed, I don't see any Russian in there. Why is that?
It's a great question. It really is a great question. The short and easy answer is that there is nobody in the editorial board because I don't know him or her. I mean, that's the first answer. But the second part of the answer is that I do not know of any piece of scholarship produced by the Russian Academy about Cuba that is not in Russian, which I cannot no longer read. There was a moment in my life in which I could read Russian. I can't anymore. And you don't really see this stuff circulate in either English or Spanish. So I can tell you that we have not received any submission in the last 2.5 years. Is that so? 4 years? Yeah.
Me too.
Let me tell you a couple of personal anecdotes. First of all, when I went to Cornell University, I was so stupid that as a second language, it occurs to me to learn Russian. And I was at the time in my 30s, and there was all these young people that were getting like this. And I was in Ithaca, New York, snowing, and practicing Russian, and it's like I was in Siberia. So, why I did that? Because I was writing a dissertation comparing unemployment and employment problems in Cuba, the Soviet Union, China, and Yugoslavia. So I was interested in knowing what the Instituto de Estudios Latinoamericanos, the Institute of Latin American Studies, has in Moscow. And we went there, Elena and I, in 1978. It was extremely difficult. I have arranged to go there and meet the people, and when I arrived and called, nobody was there. Well, they were on vacation. So finally, I found that there was an economist that I have written on Cuba, and I made contact with him, and they gave me a 1-hour interview in this place. They didn't allow me to see anything in the library. I don't think I will be able to do something because I hate Russian, frankly. I use it only for my dissertation, and I forgot about it. But then it was incredible. We were 1 hour. The room was completely tapizado, no? Or hostelries. You can hear anything from outside. When I was leaving, this Russian economist asked the chief that was there all the time whether he can give me a copy of his book. And that I understood in Russian, of course. And he said, yes, okay. And then he gave me, I gave him, he gave me the copy of his book, and when we were leaving outside, say, please invite me to the United States. Well, why all this? Because after I was there, Professor Cobb Blazer, that was the founder of the Center for Latin American Study and my boss for several years, his Russian was perfect. As he decided to spend 4 months in Moscow, he went in the winter. So you can imagine, and he spent the whole 4 months in the library of the Institute of Latin American Studies, and he told me it was very little what I could find there. I have followed publications, very few publications on Cuba, and frankly, in all these 44 years of a journal, and I have been working on Cuba for 55 years, I have not seen nothing of substance, except for articles, articles in the press, published of real Cuban scholarship in Russia.
Well, I have to say this because my dream back in 2004 was that I was going to do research on the Communist Party in Cuba through the Moscow archives. And what I discovered was that the post-Soviet state under Putin believes that Cuba is still active. And so while, like, if you look at the Comintern and then you look at what is the archive of the Communist Party, which is housed in Moscow, with one exception, the index it's organized by country because they had movements and all kinds of agents everywhere, some of whom were open members of the party and others who were not. The index is in Russian. If you go to their website, you can find information on how to access these countries. It could be Peru, it could be Argentina. At that point in 2004, they didn't have even that, but it was easy to find. It was easy to find this information. So what's the story? So effectively, the index is in Russian, and you have to pay for the service of having an archivist get you your documents on the country that you're working on. But the whole archive goes all the way up through the 80s, you know? And that's not the case for Cuba. Cuba's sealed after 1936. So you have no access. That doesn't exist. It's not been declassified. It's considered active. And as a result, you know, you can't do research in the Moscow archive that for all other countries is totally open on the Communist Party. The important thing is that the documents are in the language of the country. So all correspondence between Moscow and the headquarters of the party and those of Peru or what have you, or El Salvador for that matter, are in the language of the country. So it's totally accessible, you know, to somebody who doesn't speak Russian. The only thing you need to have that entry point. Okay, so I have a graduate student currently named Lexi Baldesi, who was very interested. Her dissertation is about the economy of austerity and black markets and the 70s and the 80s in particular. And she wanted to learn Russian, and she wanted to go to Russia. And, you know, frankly, she was already fluent in Spanish when she arrived at the University of Florida, despite her gringo status and being from Illinois. You know, beautifully fluent in both written and Spanish, and so she needed another language, and it was hard to convince the University of Florida to accept Russian as her second language, because Portuguese is what you would normally think. But she got it, and she's been doing work there. And what happens is that you don't have access to archival materials that are official, but you do have personal archives. And there are lots of Russians who came to Cuba and stayed. And they did so because their country was very Stalinist and Cuba was Stalinist, but they will tell you Cuba was better than living in Russia in the 70s or the 80s. And so they stayed. And they have all kinds of documents that they make available to you. The same is true in Russia. Lots of Cubans who married Russians. And so Lexi is not at a deficit for accessing this, or even doing, you know, oral history and testimonies and all this kind of stuff in Moscow. But you do need to know Russian. A lot of these Cubans haven't spoken Spanish for 30 years, 40 years, you know, and their primary language is Russian. So there is a total, like there's a hidden archive, which is, you know, there are many hidden archives for Cuba, one of which is in Russia and in Russian, regardless of where it might be found. There are lots of other hidden archives, you know, for Cubans in general. And then there is this whole history to be discovered of the degree to which the Soviet Union impacted Cuban culture, Cuban policies, the Cuban public, how it did so, and these extraordinary, migrations from one place to the other. So that's what I would say.
We would be very hard pressed to name a good, a serious Russian scholar on Cuba. We would be really hard pressed to identify that person.
Testimony from Russian or Soviet advisors who fought at Cuba in English. It's been published in English. I mean, I know that's not exactly Cuba, but it was them fighting alongside the Cubans at Cuba. In terms of some of the things that were in actually events in Cuba, there was you may remember that the Soviet Combat Brigade left in the early 90s. It was a border cruise ship, and it used to be called, you might be interested to know, Study Group 2. That was its code name. Just so to let you know. And there's also little bits which presumably somebody did research one day. At the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, there's about 12 tombs of Russian soldiers who died on exactly the same day in 1962. And then there was also, around that time, a munitions dump exploded at Coloma in Pinar del Rio. And people in Pinar del Rio remember, including my wife, because they all had to get under their beds. I'm just saying these are things, it was a Russian munitions dump.
Yeah.
So these are things that could be looked into.
There was a Russian historian, Pyotr Mironchuk, who worked at the Institute of Cuban History, actually, for a number of years. I don't think he would be interested in being in the board of Cuban Studies, frankly, and I don't think I would invite him anyways. I mean, he was a terrible historian. In Spanish, he was pretty bad, so.
Terms cubanólogo and cubanistas. Would you care to distinguish this?
Well, so cubanólogos, Carmelo can speak to this better than me, of course, but cubanólogos, this is a term of my youth, right? And it's a term that brings back memories of confrontations and wars and secret journals like Cuban Studies, in order, as I said, you could not read Cuban Studies at the Biblioteca Nacional, except that Cuba is Cuba, right? So everything is prohibited, but nothing is impossible. So if you had a friend who was a bibliotecario, she or he would get you access. And so I actually got to read very deeply into Cuban studies in the 1980s when I was still a student at the law school at the University of Havana, thanks to Israel Echeverria, who is now deceased, and who in fact made it a point as a bibliotecario, always made it a point to give access to youngsters to this stuff. When I read Cuban Studies, Cuban Studies was exactly the opposite that I thought I would read about. I always thought that this was some kind of political pamphlet against the revolution. And many of those articles were surprisingly reddish, they were very favorable to the, they were more than pink, actually. They were pretty. In some cases, I didn't agree with what I was reading, but the articles were all very serious, and in many cases, in fact, they had a favorable assessment of some of the things that were happening in Cuba. But they were still, in our world, this was still the work of the enemy. This was not the work of people doing serious scholarship. They were people who were on the other side of the Florida Straits. So Cubanólogo, I think it's almost impossible to separate Cubanólogo from that history and from those connotations, and that's why I tend to use Cubanista as a term that is more inclusive and it's not loaded with this history of, this ugly history of confrontation. And, I always tell the story that I had heard about Carmelo's work, of course, and I had read some of his work before I came here. And then I met Carmelo, right? And everything that Carmelo seemed to be obsessed about was calculating the Cuban internal product. And the first time I came to his office at the University of Pittsburgh, he brought all these huge tables in front of me and told me, look at this. How can you calculate the Producto Interno Bruto? And I thought, if this guy is really a CIA guy, the CIA is in trouble, So these were serious scholars, but the term Cubanólogo tainted them and sort of tried to convey the image that they were just people at the service of some kind of imperial agency or something like that.
Well, actually, among us, we never call Cubanologos. We never did that. And this is just a following of the Sovietologist with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And actually, the first time that the word Cubanologo was used was in Cuba. And let me tell you something. I mean, I don't want to appear that I am more important than I am, but I have to reflect on the fact that I was in the Soviet Union because after that trip in 1978, I went back. I think it was in 1982. Actually, it was with Alejandro Fuente. And then we have an exchange with these people. And our photo appeared because we went to the publication that they had, the Institute of Latin American Studies in Spanish. I was photographed. And then I was invited to China. I was lecturing all over China. That was in the newspaper. I think at that point, my feeling is that the Cubans said, this guy may be really dangerous because he's not only with the enemy, but he's with our allies. And so they began a series of articles published, as I said before, by Swedish, American experts on Cuba. They were extremely critical. And we answered, Jorge Perez Lopez and I, we answered all of them in a journal called Comparative Economic Systems. And then Jose Luis Rodriguez wrote a book about Cubanología. It was the first time that the word was used. And this is what I refer in my presentation that I proposed to him to publish his article in Cuban Studies, and he published my answer in Cuba. And my understanding is that that was a bestseller in Havana. So we don't like that word. I think, as Alejandro said, it's loaded. And the word Cubanistas, unfortunately, he's not here, but it was an idea of Marifeli Pérez Estable. She invented the word Cubanistas as a more neutral term. And this is what we can be using since then. We are talking about, this is 83, 80, 86, 1983, 1986.
Hello. My name is Jack Berdebeck. I'm a PhD student here at Florida International University. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you for the revitalization of this journal. I think it's terrific. I'd like to know how, or if you can speak more about how this can be used as a platform to really kind of develop Cuban scholarship, and also maybe as a tool to continue the relationship development between Cuba and the United States.
So the journal is in first of all, the journal is open to submissions from anybody. We are, at the moment, we have, I have to say that the downside of success is that we are now rejecting about close to 20% of submissions, which is not very high. So it's, and especially with, I was talking to Carmelo about this today, especially with junior scholars. What we do is we work with them. If they send something that needs work, we say, okay, this is not quite ready yet, but let's work on this. And I think, have published every piece that a junior scholar has sent, even though sometimes it has taken 2 or 3 rounds of dealing with us. It has to, they have to get through that and through the external readers. But at the end, their articles are way better. So one of the interesting things that is happening is that people are now proposing all kinds of dossiers to be published in the journal. So we had this dossier on demography that was actually our curatorial kind of creation, our editorial decision. It was not sent to us as a dossier. We put the dossier together. But in 44, the dossier on the Cuban economy was, in fact, conceived as a dossier by Jorge Dominguez and by his collaborators. In the next issue, we have 2 dossiers, one on constitutionalism in Cuba, which was proposed by scholars living in Cuba who are thinking about what the importance about constitutional change and how to think about a new constitutional order. So they put together a group of authors and they submitted their dossier. That is forthcoming in the next volume. It's approved. It's in the editorial process now. And there is a second dossier on the new historiography on public health in Cuba, because there is something of a mini boom going on among really young historians who are revising the history of public health in Cuba, especially during the Republic. So the scholars who collaborate with us are shaping, in fact, where the journal goes. One of the things we are doing, for instance, we created this section on sources that Lily made reference to. We are doing that. We created the section. This was Lily's idea. It was all, she pushed really hard for this, trust me. And I thought it was a great idea, because we are putting out there interviews, oral histories, and other materials that would otherwise be inaccessible to researchers. So we are putting that out there. And at the same time, we're inviting scholars, people like you, you're going to be writing a dissertation. You may come across a really interesting and unusual source, something that nobody has looked or has seen before. It may be worth publishing as a source and sharing with the rest of, with the scholarly community. But in a sense, the journal is being pushed in different directions by this sort of new cohort of Cubanistas who are, many of whom I do not, or we do not know personally, although in many cases we do, because it's not such a huge field after all. We're getting submissions, the last two submissions, one came from Mexico, the other one came from Cienfuegos. The one from Cienfuegos is on the Orquesta Aragon. I can tell you, we're going to publish that stuff, We're going to publish this history of the Orquesta Aragon. So people, especially junior scholars, are the ones who are, and that's exactly the way it should be. It shouldn't be that we say what should be published or not. It should be that people who are doing the actual research work out there in different fields push the journal in the direction in which the scholarship is. Our real job is to be representative of what's going on out there, of what people are producing. Does that answer your question? Lily, you want to say something about that?
There's a lot to say. I think that, we have accepted, or I shouldn't say I, because it's really Alejandro, has accepted manuscripts written by people who are, one person, Emily Snyder, who's an undergraduate, and who presented a paper on art to Carmelo's, one of Carmelo's many organizations in which he's had a pioneering role, and it won a prize. The Cuban Association for the Study, Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. Anyway, and that doesn't happen. I mean, when I was a whippersnapper, and I was a whippersnapper when I was, in the 1990s, I was a whippersnapper because I was encouraged by my advisors at the University of Wisconsin in Madison to do whatever I could with, my research. And I did this thing on Puerto Rico, and it was actually very difficult to get people's attention when you're, just trying to present part of your master's thesis for publication. So I ended up doing instead of trying to get an article published, I just said, hey, because of my advisors, I said, hey, I'll just try and go for the book out of the master's thesis. But, it was easier to get people's attention with a book than it was to get an article published. And I don't think that's untrue. Today, I think it's still very difficult to get articles published, even when you're a senior scholar, for so many reasons. One of them has to do with academic culture. We could go on and on about this, but I think it's very striking that Cuban studies, you look at some of the best articles published in 43 and 44, and we already have 45, pretty much, I think it's done, it's in press. And you see who are the people who are contributing the primary articles, and they're all, the vast majority of them are very young people doing extraordinary stuff. And it's in part because they're fearless about going after information and have been empowered to do so by now 2 generations of advisors who have said to them, do it. And then people like Carmelo, and I think it's important to note that Carmelo and Jorge Dominguez and others of his generation, Marifeli Pérez Estable, suffered greatly rejection by other academics. You know, I'm sure on more than one occasion, Carmelo was, you know, accused of being an agent of Castro. And frankly, I think that it's a mark of pride to have been accused of being a double agent, of being an agent. I mean, you know, and I have dealt with that myself so often, simply because I spent so much time in Cuba trying to be, my whole social life at one point was in Cuba, trying to really saturate myself in what the society had experienced. And it was easy to do because of the 180 people, you know, including my uncles, everybody in my father's family. You know, it was easy to do. It was not hard for me, as it is difficult for many people. It was easy, so I could do it. In the end, I think that it is still a valiant thing to be somebody who works on Cuba, to be from this country, to not have a Cuban relative on the island or know anything about Cuba, and not only do that kind of work, but then send it to Cuban Studies and see that it's taken seriously, is the most wonderful and perhaps you know, unusual experience that you will have. But it's very empowering, and it does more than affect the individual. It affects everybody who reads that article, who looks at this person's name and says, "Who is this?" And she hasn't even published a book yet, and she's in, you know, the launching journal of Cuban Studies. Who is this person who worked on Mazorra? By the way, that's Jenny Lamb. You know, or Emily Snyder, the one I've already mentioned. I mean, you know, you look at the names and you don't recognize them as a senior scholar, but when you're a junior scholar or you're just a student, and you know, and you look at the bibliography of these folks and you find none, that says so much. I think that is what, you know, this journal is doing that most journals don't do, regardless of field, and certainly in Latin American history, which is my field, they don't do. They don't want to do that.
To find it in libraries like Jose Marti Library or La Universidad de La Habana? How do you distribute that inside Cuba so they can reach, it can reach people?
So I can tell you that it is available at the Biblioteca Nacional, and it's actually available. I mean, you can actually see it now, because I have checked on this. And because the director of the Biblioteca Nacional is a true intellectual, Eduardo Torres Cuevas is a real intellectual who cares about the library. I do not know about other, I mean, I have no idea if it's available anywhere else. I do not know the answer to that. I don't know.
Would that be a way to just get in? Or?
Probably not.
No?
Probably better to stay away from the embassy.
Okay.
And so the way we get these things to Cuba is the old-fashioned way. Los amigos y las maletas, and you know the story, right?
Wait, I have to say that, okay, at the University of Havana, I mean, the one part of the University of Florida is utterly committed to exchanges with Cuba is the library system. And Eduardo Torres Cuevas has come twice who's the director of the National Library, has come twice. He's going to come again in June. And we have gone there, myself and the Dean of Libraries, with a team of librarians multiple times. So the University of Havana makes available Cuban studies, as it does many journals, electronically through this bank of computers, which is a new wing. It's a new room, and the library, it's the most used, because if you're a student at the University of Havana, you don't have to pay for logins to log in and to surf the internet or to use internet resources. So the Digital Library of the Caribbean, which is another extraordinary resource, is also available, and that's an FIU grounded library archive, really. I mean, we have a number of institutions, including Duke and Harvard, that participate in it, along with the University of the West Indies, that put things online. The largest collection for the Digital Library of the Caribbean is Haiti. Cuba is the second largest. I mean, Haiti, right? That's incredible. It has a lot to do with Brooke, who is who really pushed for the two countries that were the least represented digitally in Latin America to be the most represented in the Digital Library of the Caribbean. So University of Havana, you can access Cuban studies as you would at the University of Florida or you would at any other institution in the United States. The only problem is, of course, that you can only do it kind of page by page. So it's extremely slow. And that's where the government steps in. I don't think any of us would be surprised to know that. You can pay for the service at a hotel premium, and you're still extremely slow. And at the University of Havana is the case. So I've had people email me and say, I downloaded 5 pages in 5 days over 5 hours of an article in Cuban studies. Random people who think I'm a librarian. And because we distributed cards and whatnot, and so then could you send it to me as a PDF? And I do, and it gets through Gmail or Yahoo or whatever. And who knows how they read it? They definitely they aren't able to print it. It's extremely slow, but that it exists is extraordinary. And it's the result of the efforts of, like for instance, the director of the library system at the University of Havana is somebody around my age or Alejandro's age. Her entire staff is under the age of 27. They're all very young. And that's for a reason, in part, I won't get into that. Let's not talk about that. But they're very interested in access, and she is probably one of the first people to be very interested in access. And the University of Havana is not the National Library. It's under the Ministry of Education. National Library is under Ministry of Culture, and all of these kinds of parts of the government of Cuba have different cultures and different commitments to these questions.
I think we need to go. Yeah. Folks, thank you all for coming, and volume 45 is on its way, okay? It's forthcoming. Thank you.
Folks, I do have the 43 and 44 are for sale behind the counter. The authors will be sitting here for a few more moments if you wanted to ask some questions. If I could have you fold your chairs when you leave, that would be great. Thank you all so much for coming.